And likewise, let me put the chat where I can see it. If you need me to slow down, you miss a bit, you don't understand a bit, just shout out at me. There's far too many slides, which is my normal way, death by PowerPoint. And we resolve this by not getting through them all. Simple as that. So, introduction to Wardley mapping. I understand most people are relatively new, so we'll keep this basic. And where are we going to start? So I'm going to talk about the issue of strategy. Then I'm going to talk about maps. And then I'm going to be talking about being trapped by context. Then I'll talk about patterns. Then I'll talk about just do it, get on with it. And finally, I can talk about sovereignty if we ever get that far, which is the whole digital sovereignty stuff, or we can talk about organization or culture. Actually, we'll talk about culture in that one, but if we get there. So strategy, okay. That's where we're going to start. And for me, this is quite a old topic. And it all started when I used to work for this company. So this is for Tango. It was an online photo service, about 16 different lines of business, very profitable, revenue rapidly growing, about 10 million users in total across all the services, but it had a big problem. And that big problem was this person, the CEO. The CEO was a fake CEO. They were making it up as they went along. They didn't have a clue what they were doing. They were talking gibberish most of the time. And I know this because I was the CEO. I hadn't got a clue. I was there, I was running this company where profit going up, revenue, I'm just making it up. And so I started to think, well, you know, I make statements and vision statements, things like this. Our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. This was 2003. We were a big Perl shop. I hired most of the Perl pumpkins, so I ran the language Perl itself. And we were heavy adopters of extreme programming. I know Kent Beck. We'd actually adopted XP throughout the organization, 2002. But the problem with this statement was I'd literally pinched it from another company and just changed a few words. That was the level of my ability. And so I used to go around recording other CEOs talking about strategy. I've done this every few years. And what I look for are the sort of special words that they use. I call them business level abstractions of a healthy strategy, or BLAS for short. And this is what I did in 2014. Common BLAS, things like digital business, big data, disruptive, innovative, collaborative, competitive advantage, ecosystem, open source, blah, blah, blah. And then what I also did was I grabbed all these companies' statements and I created a BLA template. So our strategy is BLA. We will lead a BLA effort of the market through our use of BLA and BLA to build a BLA. And then I would just smash the BLA templates and the BLAs together and auto-generate at random 64 different strategies. And I've done this many, many times. So things like this. Our strategy is innovative digital business. We will lead a growth effort of the market through our use of customer-focused competitive advantage and disruptive social. It's just random gibberish. But I would send this around. And the last time, actually, I haven't done this in quite some time, actually. It was about 2014, last time I did this. I got about 400 responses back, 3 basic types. Those types were, this is the exact wording from our business plan. I've seen 2 of these used already. And are you for hire, which always made me smile. Well, anyway, a friend of mine has put this all online. This is strategy as a service. So if you ever need a strategy, just type in the URL. It will generate you one based upon nothing whatsoever. If it makes you feel comfortable, you can pretend there's blockchain and AI and I don't know, whatever. Just maybe there's some drones in the background, but it is just randomly inserting words into a template. So our strategy is collaborative. We will lead an open effort of the market through our use of big data and social media to build a digital business. God, that sounds exciting. If you don't like it, it's very simple. Just press refresh and it will automatically generate you a new one. So I hadn't got a clue what I was doing, but I sort of, even back in 2004, 2005, I had a suspicion that I might not be the only person who was making this up. So I went to I was in a bookstore, and I was talking to the bookseller because I read everything I could find on strategy and was getting absolutely nowhere. And she recommended that I read something called Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Actually, she was very good. She persuaded me to buy 2 different copies of the book because they're all translations, so they're all subtly different. And I've got to say, I'm very grateful, because it was in reading the second translation that something really struck me. So when Sun Tzu talked about competition, he talked about 5 factors that really mattered. 1, understand your purpose, your moral imperative, why we're doing something. 2nd, understand the landscape, the environment which we're competing in. Next, understand the climactic patterns. So that's how the landscape is changing, the weather. Next, understand doctrine, principles of operating. Finally, you're into the leadership bit. So that's about, how you, direction that you take. And then I came across John Boyd. And John Boyd is a US Air Force pilot, famous for creating something called the OODA loop. So you've got the game, your purpose. The first thing, the first O of OODA, is to observe the environment. And that's what landscape and climactic patterns are about. Then you orientate yourself around the space. That's what doctrine's about. So principles of operating. And finally, you decide where you're going to act, and then you act. And that's the leadership bit. That's also where you have gameplay. I was quite excited by this. So observe, orientate, decide, act, it all sort of made sense. And at the heart of this are 2 whys. The why of purpose, my moral imperative, and the why of movement. Do I make this choice over that choice? So if you think of a game of chess, the why of purpose might be to win the game. The why of movement is, do I move this piece or that piece? And it's a cycle. And the more you play the game, the better you understand the landscape, the better you understand the different patterns. So I really got into this idea of landscape because I started looking into military history. Thought, well, how do we understand the landscape? And pretty simply, we use maps. Well, that's obvious enough. So this is the Battle of Thermopylae. This is Themistocles, top left-hand side. He's got a problem. The Persians are invading, about 140 to 170,000 Persians. What they decide to do was to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians into a narrow pass, a coastal road, into this pass called Thermopylae, where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. Now, there were about 4,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans. So you've ever heard the story of the 300, that's where it comes from. So I was looking at this and thinking, all right, I understand that. We can all talk and coordinate around this map. What are the sort of processes that I use to decide what we're going to do? And so I used to use things called SWOT diagrams. And so I thought, right, let's do a SWOT of this. So strengths, a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. That seems sensible. Weaknesses, the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up, okay. Opportunities, get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. Themistocles was actually Athenian, so we didn't like the Spartans anyway. And the threats, the Persians get rid of us. And the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years from now. So I simply thought to myself, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described by some sort of map or some sort of magic framework like a SWOT diagram. I looked at this and I thought, well, gosh, well, it's so obvious. You would use a map. And then I thought, okay, but what am I actually using? Well, I was using SWOT diagrams. So I started to think, right, okay, I need to understand a little bit more about these maps. So I started looking throughout my organization for the maps that we had, and I had loads of maps. I had business process maps, I had mind maps, I had systems maps. This is a system map. It's one of our lines of business, one of the 16. It's got various components linked together. I've just highlighted CRM, customer relationship management, in gray. And then I did something odd. I looked at this map and I moved CRM from there to there. And I thought, has the map changed? No, still the same. And I looked at a geographical map and I said, right, if I took Australia and moved it next to, say, England, would that change the map? And the answer is yes. So why doesn't it change it here? And it doesn't change it here because this is not a map. The one thing that pretty much every map we have of business has in common is they're not maps. They're all graphs. Now, explain the difference. The three images at the top are all graphs and they're all identical. They're three places, Nottingham, London, Dover, connected by 2 roads, M1, M2. The 3 at the top are identical and they're graphs. The 3 at the bottom are all different and they're maps. And the difference between a graph and a map is quite simply, space has meaning. So if you move a piece on a map, it changes the context. And that's how we learn about a territory. Now, space having meaning comes from 3 characteristics. 1, you need an anchor, such as magnetic north. Secondly, you need position of pieces relative to each other. This is north, south, east, or west of that. And lastly, you need to have consistency of movement. So if I'm going north, I'm going north. If I'm going south, I'm going south. So you need anchor, position, and movement. So I thought I'd create a map of my business. But I started off actually with a tea shop. I thought, right, what am I going to have as an anchor for a tea shop? Well, I thought we've got multiple different users. One is the public who drink tea. We've got the business who wants to sell tea. We've also got regulators and maybe others, shareholders, etc. So I just thought I'd pick those 2, the users, public users and the business. They're going to be my anchor. So what now? Well, they have needs. And the public has a need to drink cups of tea, we hope, and the business has a need to sell cups of tea. Okay, so I've now got an anchor and a need. That doesn't give me position. Fortunately, to make a cup of tea, I need multiple things. I need a cup, tea, hot water, and hot water needs cold water and a kettle needs power. Now, this is a chain of needs. Now, to the public consumer who's drinking the cup of tea, the power that you use to heat the water in the kettle, well, they probably don't know who your power supplier is. That's not very visible to them. So that's a metaphor for distance. So the further you go down the chain, the further things are away, the less visible they are. So now I can do anchor, and I've got position through visibility. Now, it turns out that all these components also evolve. And there's a common pattern how things evolve. You start off, if you're talking about physical activities, the genesis of novel and new things, custom-built examples, products and rental services, commodity and utility services. Now, this really should say stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's fairly meaningless, so I put the labels genesis, custom, product, commodity, but it's not just physical things that evolve, but data does, knowledge does, even ethical values do. We just give them different words. So when we're talking about practices, novel, emerging, good, and best. When we're talking about knowledge, concept, hypothesis, theory, and then more universally accepted. So now I've got anchor, position, and movement. If I move a piece on the map, it changes the context. Great. Well, the first thing is it enables somebody else to add something I'm missing, like you're missing staff. And then somebody can come along and say, hey, staff, that should be robots, all right? Somebody else can come along and say, well, actually, each of the nodes are stocks of capital, each of the lines are flows. So we can put metrics on them. We can create a little P&L. Excellent. Somebody else can come along and say, why are you custom building kettles? Shouldn't you be using standard kettles? And then somebody could come along and say, oh, it's brand exclusivity. It's our special range of our cup of tea is made in, I don't know, immortality giving kettles or whatever. The point about this, it doesn't matter whether you're from finance, operations, or business, or marketing, or sales, or whatever. We can all talk about the same environment using a map. So that led me to trapped by context. I'm going to start off with an insurance company. So this insurance company, this was many, many years ago. This is the process flow that they had for getting new compute into their data centers. They need compute, they order server comes into goods in, they'd modify Mount Racket. Oh gosh, this was about 8-9 years ago. They had a bottleneck to do with modification of service. So they'd spent 6 months looking at this problem and had come up with all sorts of wonderful ideas and eventually decided on using robotics to solve the problem. And they'd had a lovely business case put together, tens of millions investment, return on investment calculation, sub 1 year, all this sort of stuff, lots of SWOT diagrams, everything, fabulous. So the problem is they asked me to have a look at this. And if I'd gone in and said, why do you need robots? Of course, I'm challenging the narrative and the story. And of course, in corporations, stories are highly political, linked to the storyteller. So all that would have happened would be a big fight. So I didn't. I just said, could you map it for me? Showed them a map, and they spent 15 minutes. That was the map they produced. User needs compute. Compute order server, goods in. Goods in, server, order server, all thought of as commodity. Compute, for some bizarre reason, thought of more product. A rack, mount, modify. I looked at the map and just went, why have you got rack in custom built? And the answer came back, because we have custom built racks. We have a company that makes our racks for us. So what are the modifications you're making to servers? Well, the servers we buy don't fit our racks. So we have to take the cases off them, drill new holes, add new plates in order to get them to fit our racks. And that's why you need robots, yes. Now in that meeting, somebody just went, hang on, why aren't we using standard racks? Now these people weren't daft, these people were trapped by context. So obviously the answer is use standard racks. But this is probably one of the most common problems I see. People optimizing bottlenecks and improving process flow, which is what you would, if you were following that path, you would go and do robotics, etc. When actually you need to, first of all, manage evolutionary flow. You need to treat things the way they should be treated. It didn't take them long. As soon as they saw the environment, then they could challenge the entire narrative which trapped them. So I'll give you another example. HS2, high-speed rail. So this is a friend of mine, James Finley. He was the CIO. They decided to build the entire railway in a virtual world. And the reason for doing this is it's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and go, whoops, we got that wrong, than it is to dig up the actual countryside. So HS2, high-speed rail, big, enormous project. This is 2012. And so this is the systems diagram, the graph, various components that were needed, simplified somewhat. And this is James's problem. James was thinking, well, which bits do I outsource? Which bits do I build in-house? Which bits do I use off-the-shelf products? Now that simple set of 3 questions applied to that diagram gives you 387 million possible permutations. So which one is right? He had no idea. So in government at the time, what was quite common was we would just outsource the whole lot because that's like simple. And then we would break things into what we call lots, contract structures. So you'd have like lot one engineering, where we combine all the engineering-y things together into one contract. Lot two user experience, so it grabs that which seems like that's user related, we'll put that into another contract. Lot three back office, another one. Lot four infrastructure. Okay. So James decided not to do it this way. This is the sort of normal approach. He's an old friend of mine, so he decided to draw a map. He spent an afternoon on Sunday, drew a basic map, sent it to me, and said, how do we manage this? So I turned it into, just tidied it up a little bit. And for me, this was quite easy. And the reason why it was easy was something I'd learned back in 2005, 2006. What I'd learned is that when you look at a map, all your components evolve, and as they evolve, their characteristics change. So they go from this uncharted space of being chaotic, uncertain, unpredictable. Doesn't matter whether it's money or penicillin or computing. And eventually they end up industrialized, ordered, known, measured, stable, boring, dull. Now, because of those polar opposite characteristics, and there's a different set of characteristics in the middle, there's no such thing as one size fits all method. What we'd learned back in about 2006 is extreme programming was very good on the left-hand side because it was good at reducing the cost of change, where change is the norm. But it's terrible compared to something like Six Sigma on the right-hand side, which Six Sigma is best there because it's all about reducing deviation, which is what you want for something which is more commodity utility. And in the middle, well, we were scrambling with the method, but lean is almost certainly the better way of doing it. Scrum, MVP, all those, that sort of stuff, because you're focused on learning and reducing waste. It's the same with purchasing methods, you know, VC-based, sort of more COTS-based. There are multiple methods you use. There isn't one size fits all technique. Now, because of that, well, two things happen. First, if you ever go to a conference and tell people, if you go to an Agile conference and say Agile doesn't fit everywhere, you'll get the same responses if you go to a Six Sigma conference and go, Six Sigma doesn't fit everywhere, and the same as a lean one. Everybody just goes burn and heretic and all that sort of stuff, because everybody thinks their method fits everywhere. It doesn't. Each of them have context. So it was pretty simple. I just said, look, this is what we did back in 2006, 2007. Use appropriate methods. Just use agile development, in-house techniques on the left-hand side, off-the-shelf products in the middle, and the stuff on the right-hand side, you just outsource that. Pretty simple. Anyway, this project ended up in front of the Public Accounts Committee, being praised for being way ahead of schedule, massively under budget. And that's like a pretty unusual for a government contract. Now, normally what would happen is this. Normally we'd do it, that outsourcing everything and breaking into lot structures, okay? So let's translate what would have happened if we'd done that into mapping form. So there's the map, but now I've outsourced the whole lot. Now I'm going to apply that lot structure. That's lot one engineering. That's all put into a contract. So what's going to happen is pretty simple. The stuff on the right-hand side, so in this case, GIS, PIMS, whatever that means, will be efficiently treated because they're quite industrialized, can be defined in a contract, and they're well understood. But the stuff on the left-hand side, we don't really know what we want. We can never know what we want. It's still evolving. So that stuff is going to intend to incur excessive change control costs if we try to specify it in a contract. And in fact, we'll get into a fight with the vendor, and the vendor will be able to say, well, look, the reason why it overran massively is all your fault because you didn't specify it correctly. You didn't know what you wanted. Well, you can't know what you want. The stuff on the left just can't do it because we don't know. So by doing this lot structure with contracts, we've always certainly guaranteed massive cost overruns and failure. And I spend quite a bit of time these days with people just spending a few hours drawing out their contract structure and telling them before they've even started which project's going to fail, because it's all there in front of you. So another one is the Emergency Services Mobile Communication Platform. So this is critical national infrastructure. This is radios for police, fire service, the lifeguards, ambulances. So again, a lovely, wonderful 600-page specification, document, contract. Sit down there, say, what's the user need? No one's quite sure. So they spent an afternoon. And it doesn't take long to map this stuff. And they quickly mapped. They went to user, what do we need? Point-to-point communication, job dispatch, video evidence, video, that sort of stuff. And all of those components require components underneath this, like device and certification, etc. So once you've worked out what the components are and you have an understanding of the landscape, and we can challenge each other on where bits should be, then it becomes pretty simple to break it into sensible contract structures by grouping things, which not based upon, oh, that sounds like user experience, that sounds like engineering, but based upon how evolved those components are. Now, unfortunately, in this case, they're one of those horizontal lot structures, disaster pending. We broke it down. It literally took an afternoon. And then they decided to go with the original lot structure. And as a result, they had massive cost overruns. They've ended front public accounts. It's a great example of why they should have done what they were told to do. In fact, I was able to tell them which contracts would fail before they'd even signed the contract. But it wasn't all lost, because one of the beauties about maps is you can share them. In fact, that's probably one of the best things about maps. So immigration, borders, police, we shared maps. And what we started to discover was we had duplication on different maps. Well, that's okay. You might all have power, but sometimes those are systems or things we're building. And at least with the maps, we can ask the question, now, are we building the same thing again and again? Sure enough, we had a couple of £600 million projects, which were just the same thing. Now, I have to say, everybody thinks that government is some sort of area of waste, okay? The worst example I found in government is 118 workflow systems doing the same thing. So we've managed to build prisoner registration 118 different ways, okay? I've got a pharma company who have 350 teams building enterprise content management systems and 5 global efforts to build the global enterprise content management system, none of which knows the others exist or didn't. The worst example I've got is a bank who's managed to build risk management over 1,000 times. So they're sitting there complaining they can't innovate. And they can't innovate because they keep on rebuilding risk management. And the joke is, of course, when we discovered, they thought, oh my God, we must be terrible comparing to the other banks. No, the other banks are just as bad. So once you get beyond the trap by context, then you start learning about patterns. So the first lot of patterns you learn are climactic patterns. So these are the rules that influence and change the game. There's about 30 of these, and they're useful for anticipation. I'm certainly not going to go through them all. I'm just going to show you a couple. So here's a simple map. User needs an application built on best coding practice. You can map both activities, practices, data, knowledge, and ethical values all on the same map. On a runtime, operating system, best architectural practice on compute. So this is about 2005. Now, the first pattern you learn is everything evolves. If there's supply and demand competition, everything is moving from left to right. So back in 2005, we knew compute was going to be a utility. In fact, the first books on compute as a utility had been written many, many years before. The second thing you learn is that it's always past success which has inertia or creates inertia to change. There's about 16 different forms of inertia. And the classic example of this, so in this case, best architectural practice and the ownership of compute as a product will slow down your adoption to a more utility form. So if I've got big data centers and I'm brilliant at managing data centers, I'm going to be very dismissive of cloud. Now, my favorite example of this is Blockbuster Netflix. So first with the website Blockbuster, first with video ordering online Blockbuster, first with video streaming experiments Blockbuster, first to go bankrupt Blockbuster. So the problem with this is not that Blockbuster didn't innovate, they out-innovated everybody, including Netflix. Their problem was they had something called late fees. Late fees is how they made most of their money. You get a video cassette, you forget to bring it back, late fee, ka-ching. That created inertia to change. Okay, so it's always inertia and past success. If you think you're doing well, that's where your source of inertia is going to come from. Next pattern you learn is coevolution. So as things evolve, you always get particularly when we cross a boundary, you get some sort of new practice. And that's because characteristics change. So for example, computers as a product had what we call high MTTR, high mean time to recovery. So it would take weeks to get a new machine or months. And that's why we did disaster recovery tests, distributed systems designed for failure. Now, as it became a utility, we had low MTTR. So we can get new machines in seconds. So we can now distribute systems designed for failure, chaos engines. Did I get that wrong? I probably did. Let me do that again. Computers a product, high MTTR, high mean time to recovery, takes weeks to get new machines. So we do disaster recovery tests, N+1. That's the bit, N+1. And we would do capacity planning, scale up. As it became a utility, it has low MTTR, so we can distribute systems designed for failure, chaos engines. And eventually that new practice, we give it a flag and a name, and we called it DevOps. It was Patrick and Andy, probably 2008, something like that. The next thing you learn is efficiency enables innovation. So as the stuff like electricity becoming a utility enabled things like radio, television, computing. Electricity was a product, Siemens generators, before Tesla and Westinghouse created a utility. And before that, you had the genesis with Parthian battery, 1400 years before we started getting utility provision in 1896. Anyway, this efficiency enables new things. That's componentization, Herbert Simon's theory of hierarchy, pretty straightforward. And of course, these new higher order systems create new sources of value and worth to individuals. So like electricity enables radio, television, computing. Some of those become valuable, whereas other things like the refrigeration blanket is a good example. It didn't become successful. These cause an effect known as the red coin. So as things evolve, they become more efficient. They enable new practices, which increases speed. They enable new needs, which increases value. If you're competing against somebody who has efficiency, speed, and value over you, then you have pressure to evolve. As more of your market adapts, the pressure on you mounts, which is why you have no choice. That's called the red queen. The only way you can stop it is if you can get everybody in the market not to adapt. Now, from my point of view, it's good for mergers. It's good for identifying where I should invest. So back in 2008, I ran strategy for a company called Canonical, who provides something called Ubuntu. We used the maps to identify where the market was changing, where we need to focus. We knew it was all going utility. We knew there'd be an emerging practice. It was a bit later that the term DevOps appeared. So we focused on all these areas. We also knew where not to invest. I don't spend our time dealing with compute as a product. We're going to pull back away from that space and own the more utility space. Now in 2008, we were 3% of the operating system market. We were up against Red Hat, Microsoft. They're massive companies. We provide Ubuntu. It was small. It cost me $500,000 is the budget I spent, and 18 months to take 70% of all cloud from those massive players. Okay, and we did this because we understood exactly where we needed to attack. And I think even today, Ubuntu pretty much still dominates the cloud. I mean, anyway, that emerging practice eventually evolved, became DevOps. The runtime is now evolving. In 2014, it became basically runtime is like lamp.net. It's become Lambda. And that's creating, same thing, new emerging practice and new needs. That's where you focus today. Serverless, all this other stuff, that's the new legacy. So several points here. One, strategy is iterative. How you play the game depends on where the map is. Two, yes, I did just say DevOps is the new legacy. If you're about to start on a compute journey and looking at putting in DevOps, if you're as fast as Netflix, it will take you at least 7 years, because that's how long it took them. I assume you're not as fast as Netflix. If you're a bit slower, it's going to take you 10 years. If you were starting today, that means 2030 is by the time you will have done it all, in which case you've just built the new legacy. Today, you need to move up the stack. Of course, if you go and say that at a DevOps conference, everybody says burning, but there we are. So now I move on to just do it. Right, maps are imperfect representations of a space, okay? No map is perfect. This is a map of France. It's not perfect, but it's useful. In order to be a perfect map of France, it would have to be 1-to-1 scale, which means it would have to be the size of France. Therefore, it would have to be France itself. In order to be useful, maps have to be imperfect. They're also models, so they're also wrong. So they're imperfect and wrong, but fortunately, they turn out to be useful. So I used them back in 2009, 2010 for writing something called the Better for Less paper with friends of mine, Liam Maxwell and others. This led to the helped in creation of something called GDS, Government Digital Services, and also spend control within UK government. So this was written for Francis Board. This is back in 2010, and it was for the incoming government. We've used maps all over the place. If you talk to Mark Craddock, I mean, one particular system which was built as a result of mapping saved the UK economy about 12 billion, which is an enormous figure. This is another example, Liam Maxwell, just one particular project, we saved about 425 million by about 1.5 billion in its lifetime, simply by mapping it. That's not the stuff that really excites me. This is the stuff I find much more interesting. RNLI, this is James Finley, they use mapping there to reduce call out time. So they got it down from about, I think it was about 18 minutes to 20 odd seconds or something like that before the call gets through. It was a strange system beforehand. As a result, it saves lives. James was telling me about 1,000 lives around the UK is what they're estimating. It also gets used in interesting places. This is United Nations Global Platform. Basically, it was a project run by won by ONS, Office of National Statistics. They use mapping heavily to understand the space, and that's what led them down this particular pathway. The new UN handbook on information technology strategy has maps all the way through it. It's also used in things like venture capital firms. So one of my favorites is Pekka over in India. So Prasanna has 48, well, he is more now, 48 startups all using mapping. They're doing all very well. But another one is, in books. It gets used all over the place. So one of my AWS second ever book, that's at Amazon Web Services. If you ever buy a copy of it, if you go to page 57, there we are, mapping your way through. It basically, it's about 15 pages of mapping in there, including one of my favorite, which is the ILC model, the innovate, leverage, commoditize model, which is basically how they tear up industry after industry. It's great. I saw at Amazon a couple of years ago doing a map of the entire AI industry, explaining how they're attacked, because they can tell people this stuff, because most people go, I don't even know what that is. But the other one is the Puncher Scroll. So this is a science fiction book written with mapping. It's being currently turned into film at the moment. It's described as the new Ready Player One. It's all built with mapping by Tao Klein. So this map stuff get all over the place. So how do you get started? People say, how do you get started? It's really simple. Number one, know your users. Like tea shop, public, business. Number two, focus on user needs. I.e., they want a cup of tea. We want to make profit from selling cups of tea. Three, understand the details. Know how to make a cup of tea. Four, understand what is being considered. I.e., it's not enough to know the details like it needs a kettle. We need to know, is it a custom-built kettle? Is it more commodity? How evolved the thing is. So understand what is being considered. Now we have a common language that other people can come and challenge what we're doing, add components we're missing. We can also now start challenging assumptions. Why are we custom building kettles? Without the storytelling. Because of brand exclusivity. Great. We can also share the maps and start removing bias and duplication in an organization. We don't have to rebuild power and water if we've got it elsewhere, for example. Now we can start using appropriate methods. And now we can start having, before this, we can have a bias towards data. So one of the things I like doing is spend control is a process of challenge, basically. It doesn't mean that, if you've got lots of departments, it doesn't mean they get their budget taken away from them. It simply is a process whereby before we build something, we try and map it out so that somebody can give us a bit of challenge, stop us from custom building kettles or whatever. And then we go on, do what we were going to do. We can ignore spend control if we wish, but after we've done it, we'll do a post-mortem and we'll learn. What did we learn from the maps? What did we get wrong? So it's a process of constantly having challenge and learning. And so that's what I call a bias towards data. The map's a great way. If you draw your map, you say, I think this is going to happen. This is what we're going to do. You go and do it, and you go back and look at your map again. I've written so many business cases in my life. They're all on shelves somewhere. I don't think I've ever gone back and looked at a business case after I've written it. Maps, I look at them all the time. Anyway, those are all called Doctrine. And so Doctrine are basically principles that are universally useful. So I talked about climactic patterns. Those are the rules of the game. You also get Doctrine. These are universally useful principles. There's about 40 of those. You've got gameplay, all context specific. There's about 110 of those. Well, we don't go through that because we haven't got time. And I don't want to go through Doctrine as well. It's too much. But the thing is, these Doctrine, these principles, like most things, you can map them. And you basically have components built on top of components. So in order to focus on user needs, you need to know your users. In order to know the details, the value chain, you need to understand your user need. In order to map it, you need to understand the chain. And in order to have a common language, you better be able to describe what you're considering. In order to challenge assumptions, you better have a common language, etc. Now, these are what we call phase one. There's about 40 of them. And if you ever read this is the cheat sheet. It's all Creative Commons. They're all built on top. Phase two all builds on phase one. It's an ever bigger map. They all come from mapping. They're all pretty, obvious stuff. You read them, do better with less, optimize flow. You can show them all in maps. I mean, it's easy stuff. But you'd be amazed at how bad companies are, particularly the phase one. I mean, you would think, come on, we must have a common language, challenge assumption, know our users, focus on user needs. It's amazing. It really is. It shocks me. And of course, with COVID and everything else, everybody suddenly discovered they don't understand their value chains at all. Anyway, at the bottom right-hand corner, there's something called design for constant evolution. And this is a cell-based structure known as, it's a cell-based semi-autonomous structure with a hierarchical system on top known as pioneer settlers, town planners. It's a way of constantly coping with change. It looks something like that. I won't go through it because people go, oh, we got to do this. You can read about it in GCHQ, our intelligence services, back in 2016, published something called Boiling Frogs. Go help yourself. It's all available. That basically goes through the chunks of the structure. You'll see my name there. The point about this is people get excited by that and say, oh, we must do that. And I have to tell them not to because your doctrine is terrible. You've got to get your that sort of thing is right at the very bottom. You've got to do all the basics first of all. So if I go back a couple, you've got to be able to do know your users, focus on user needs, remove bias and all of that stuff before you can do the phase 2 or the phase 3, before you can ever mess around with organizational structure. And I say that because most execs I know like to mess around with organizational structure, and I like to tell people don't. It'll make no difference whatsoever. Okay, stop messing around with things you don't understand. Structure, culture, strategy, forget them. Do the basics first. Doctrine, understand your landscape. If you do that first, the rest will follow. Otherwise, it's like this. Otherwise, what they're doing is they're on the Titanic, great big hole in the side of the ship, and they're going, let's move the deck chairs about. That'll save us. No, it won't. Okay, deal with the great big hole first. Now, at that point, I've got to sovereignty. But what I can do is I've said a lot, and sovereignty is all about digital sovereignty, and we'll have to go into culture, and there's a whole load of nonsense in that subject as well. But rather than doing that, why don't I open it up to questions? Silly book, because you must all be exhausted having listened to me for 48 minutes, you poor things. Any questions? How would you say the Pioneer Settler Town Planner connects to Big Five and other personality assessments? Okay, first of all, Myers-Briggs. So people go, oh, Myers-Briggs, can we use that to do Pioneer Settler Town Planner? And I say, go away. Myers-Briggs has less validity than astrology. And I'm afraid the way you do it is pretty simple, is you let people self-select. I'm a pioneer, I'm a settler, I'm a town planner. There's a long list of characteristics. You let people self-select, and then you let people change their mind. Do not try to impose position on people based upon some imaginary personality test, particularly if it's called Myers-Briggs, which is just garbage. My mother is an astrologist, and I have particular viewpoints about that field. Well, at least they've got more statistical validity. So in terms of other personality tests, I'm going to say, don't let people decide. And also don't go there. Look at the doctrine table. If you're not brilliant at all of that doctrine, the simple way is to take the doctrine table and sit down with people and just say, each one of these things, are we good or are we not? I'll show you why. Hang on. I'm going to just open up something else. What have I got? Let me see if I can find something else. Give me a minute. See if I've got something in here. What I need is a doctrine table. Not in that one. Hang on. Yeah, I've got hundreds of presentations and things like this. But there is, I'm hoping, because I've just recently, my machine blew up. I've had lots of fun recently. I've got my own power supplies and all this sort of stuff now as well, just in case. And hang on. Ah, I know. That's what it'll be. There we are. Right. Can you see that?
Yes.
It's all blue. Okay, that's a web engineering giant. So sitting down with them, working out, are you good at this? Are you weak? The yellowy. Are you warning? The orange. Okay, shaded. All right, that's a web engineering giant. Right, I'm going to show you a bank now. That's a bank. All right. Absolutely rubbish, the whole lot. Now, here's the good thing. Most banks look like this. And if you're rubbish, it's okay, because if everybody else is rubbish, not a problem. No one gains an advantage. The only problem is if somebody comes into your industry who's not rubbish. Okay, but if you want to start somewhere, start by doing this. Sit down and say, right, we're going to ask, are we good at this? And it's quite funny to watch a whole bunch of execs do this, because they sit down there and go, oh, do we know our users? Yes, yes, of course we know our users. Yes, we know our user needs. Yes, we under. And then somebody, hang on a minute. And then before you know it, degenerates. It's great, but most organizations are pretty shocking most of the time. So when people ask about things like Pioneer, Set the Town Planner, all good, but you've got to be really good at all of this stuff before you even contemplate it.
Simon, got a new question. Do you have any examples where mapping has been applied to public government services?
Oh yeah, within UK government, lots, food standards, loads of different places. So HS2, food standards, NHSX, they've been using some of the stuff in there and some of the bits, not in other places, which I wish they had. People like, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, Department of Work and Pensions being used there. Obviously, some interesting agencies, it's being used there. So yeah, lots of examples. Department of Education, midwifery, it's being used there. So lots of different places. And it's not just the UK.
Yeah.
Yes. By the way, that doctrine table, the banks are the worst. Sorry if anybody's from the banking world, but apologies, you are. That I've ever found. I mean, it's government's not that. Government's much better, but that's because government generally has agencies which introduce challenge. So in the UK, we have things like the National Audit Office or the Major Projects Authority, which actually, or spend control, which introduce a bit of challenge. But most corporates have the magic carpet. They lift it up and sweep it under. There we are. A resource for mapping examples from the real world. Right. Yes. So there's an awesome list. Oh, thank you for somebody putting up the awesome list. So it's all Creative Commons. We have a map camp. People come from all over the world. There's an entire Slack channels and communities. People are publishing books. They help themselves. I mean, I research into my own areas using maps. Sorry, yeah.
There is a question from Øyvind a little further up. Any good way of self-evaluating how good we are at these characteristics?
Talking with each other generally. So the interesting thing is, how do you compare yourself against others? How do you define what good is in an absolute scale? And I don't know how to do that. What I do is I ask people to ask themselves, are you good? Do you understand what your user needs are? So in the UK government, when we started, we were spending 16 to 21 billion a year on IT. And it's interesting, no one knew who the users were. And so I think it was the first 12 months, we got to 852 core transactions from somebody paying their taxes to burying a relative at sea. So we started getting an idea of what people actually use UK government for. And so it just developed from there. So I would always just ask people, right, do you know who users? Right, what are the core transactions you have with these users? And do you know who they are? And if they do, great. What do they actually need? Great, what's involved? If they can answer this all, fantastic.
Just a follow-up question there. Is there something about, what should I say, how many different opinions there are about your users' need in an organization?
No, I'd say, yeah.
How well it's understood.
So let me I'm just going to do a map here. Hang on a second. Share screen, share. Okay. So if I just draw, can you see that? Hello? Can you see a line?
Yes.
Genesis. Oh, sorry, my handwriting's terrible. Custom, product, commodity. So often you'll get, you know, we'll stick some user here, has some need. And often, you know, let's go, oh, they have a need for, I don't know, power, whatever. Now, power's a commodity. And power has a need for, I don't know, let's say transmission. And it has a need for production. Now, actually, I put this here because this is what we call a pipeline. Because there are many different forms of production. You might have, I don't know, coal. You might have wind or something, nuclear, blah, blah, blah. There might be Dyson sphere. There we are. That's one of those things which is supposed to go around the sun or something like that. There we are. So one of the things you've got with maps is these are all, I can never remember. Is it A union B? And, yes, A. So these are all ands, basically. And so power needs production and transmission. Or cup of tea needs this and this and this. But you can also have ors. So these are all ors. So production, coal, or wind, or Dyson sphere, or some combination of all of them. So what you can do with people, that's just notation you can put on the map. So you start off with, you know, user has a need for A or whoops, B or C or D, and so you can map all of this stuff out. Have I got that right? Isn't that? It's a long time since I've done logic, and I always used to get my ups and downs wrong, but hopefully that's right. So you can do logic on maps as well, and so at least you can draw it out and you can discuss those components. Does that make sense? Did I answer the question?
Yes.
Good.
Yes, somewhat.
Somewhat? Oh, well, challenge me more then.
I think it was also a bit sort of, so that was, if you can fulfill a need through different sort of means of fulfilling it, but also like, do the people in the organization understand the need in the same way as sort of your sort of core business thing, right? If it's a lot of different ways of interpreting it, you're probably not understanding the need very well. Right.
So one of the things we do in the UN is we go from reducing global poverty all the way down through all-weather roads, all the way down through national statistics organizations. So one of the beauties is when we're talking about something, people can see how things are connected all the way up, okay? And so something else that happens is that you'll often find people use different acronyms, different terms for exactly the same thing. But the beauty is once you've got it on a map, you can go, what do you mean by that? And because it's connected to these 10 things, which is exactly as this same as this thing over here. And it often turns out we're doing the same thing and everything else. So the only thing I would say is that maps at least provide you a way of putting your assumptions down so people can question. So how do you do it normally if you don't use maps?
Yeah, so I'm from a DDD background, so I'm sort of a fan of that way of approaching things, right?
Oh, okay.
Using visual collaboration, like event storming, for example, right? To what should I say? Show your understanding of something, to open it to sort of the different viewpoints.
Yeah, always good. I need a cup of tea. Oh, I better go on to that. I need a cup of tea. Why? Because I'm thirsty. It's gotcha. Right. Is the practical best done in groups? Right. Fantastic. So ultimately, the maps are very useful for pre-mortem, post-mortem as a record and everything else. But the real value is in the activity of mapping itself. I mean, there's a lot of power in maps in terms of identifying duplication, but the real value to begin with is literally the act of getting people to sit around and try to describe and understand their landscape. So if you're going to do it on your own, share it as quick as you can. Okay. Typical things that people get wrong is they try and make the perfect map. You can't. Don't worry. Make a good enough map. Share it with others because they'll often go, "You're missing. What about this? What about this?" And that'll help you refine your ideas. The second thing, it normally takes about 7 years to get good at mapping, just to warn you, okay? Now, the first 6 years in 11 months is you going, I really need to start that mapping. I really do need to start that mapping. And the last month is you actually doing some mapping. So that's what I say, it takes about 7 years. It's a bit like me and guitars. I mean, I've had the guitar back there for about 8 years. I still haven't picked it up, but I mean, 8 years of actually never playing it. No, I do play it a little bit, but badly. But the hardest thing of mapping is definitely just getting started, the fear of doing it. Or performed into it. So that's really interesting as well. So one of the, there are many different ways. So sometimes what I will do is I'll map and somebody else will map, and then we'll come together and combine maps. And sometimes we'll play against each other. So for example, in scenario planning, so we were doing this whole piece of work about drones being used for terrorist attacks and all that sort of stuff, and different scenarios, how to counterplay it. So we'd break into groups, and we'd go and basically do our map and work out, and then we'd all come back and do basically stepwise a scenario game, and all learn from, you used high altitude and shot over our radar. Damn right, next time. And so we just got better and better at playing that game. So you can do it both ways. Thinking context of weak signal. I do a lot of weak signal detection. Outliers and insight. Oh, Cynefin. I like Cynefin. Cynefin great. They both have a very similar background. And Dave's great as well. How do you validate the position on the x-axis? Right. Something called the cheat sheet. So the x-axis, and you'll find there's something called, you'll find it all in my blog, which is now in a book because somebody's put it into a book. Well, other people have as well. It's all Creative Commons, help yourself. The whole method by which that axis was created is in there, including something called the cheat sheet. So it involved 9,223 publications and a whole bunch of graphs, and then a whole long list of characteristics. And what I do is I often use the cheat sheet to help me identify where something is. I won't go through that now, but you can read it all online. You can perhaps shortcut that if you shift Q component of that learning to the right. Okay. Oh, okay. Regarding needs and root cause analysis, how do you recommend someone go? I need a cup of tea. Why? Because I'm thirsty. Absolutely. That seems perfectly reasonable. I go from the point of view, well, I also use it for mapping culture and ethical values within systems as well. So, so it's more that this needs this, or depends, or this is a precedent for this. Any platform? Well, for sharing maps, there are a number of people who've built tools for maps. There's online Wardley maps where you can create maps all online. The people have talked about building platforms for sharing maps. I'm not aware of any deliberately at the moment. People are doing it in Visual Studio. There's various plugins and other bits and pieces. 12 billion. Yes, talk to Mark Craddock. It was basically as a result of mapping, they built a system which enabled them to look at the movement of container ships and everything else. Because of this, when there was the last crash, they were able to identify the impacts far earlier than they normally would do. And the net effect was reckoned to be about 12 billion. But you'd have to talk to Mark Craddock about that. Finally, the cats. Yeah, I can't do it without cats. There we are. So, 6 new messages. Do you want me to get back to the present? Oh, I don't mind. I can do all sorts of. Take an example of the horse versus car. I need a faster horse. Why? Okay. Oh, do you want to do the automotive industry?
No, I think the point was that sort of how far do you dig into the need? Like, is the need just I need a cup of tea, or is the need I need a hot beverage, or I need like I am thirsty and want a good drink?
Okay, so these are, I like to call them Babylonian clay tablets. That's because these are not Ordnance Survey beautiful maps. These are literally lines in the sand. They're as primitive as you can get, and someone will make a better form of mapping. I've been
Ble han borte nå?
Yeah, I guess we lost him. Da får vi nok bare gi det litt tid.
Yep. Hvis dere har lyst til å stille spørsmålet selv, så er det bare å rekke opp hånden og stille oss, altså.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I suddenly dropped out. There we are. My apologies.
Oh, no worries.
Okay. Can you see me okay? Is my connection breaking up?
No, it's been fine until now, so it's been fine.
Yeah, you're back. We see you.
Okay. Good. Sorry, I live in the middle of a marsh and in the UK. So we have terrible internet because, well, it's the UK. Of course we have terrible internet. So I have 3 terrible lines. 2 of them are 4G, complete rubbish, and one of them's Fibers the Cabinet, which is awful because the cabinet's 2.8 kilometers away. So I have to channel bond across all 3 to a server in London, triplicating traffic to get something like about 15 megs download, 10 megs upload, because the lines are so rubbish. There we are. I lost where I was.
We were talking about how far you should dig into WISE.
Oh,
sort
okay.
of in understanding the user need.
Well, I go from, so I must admit, I start from the point of thinking, different users, what do they need, put them on the map, and then just go from there. What does this need? What does this need? What does this need? And just expand it accordingly. If you're asking me, is there a formal way of doing this? Remember, these maps are about 15 years old. They're more like Babylonian clay tablets, so lines in sand, rather than Ordnance Survey maps. I mean, they're really, really primitive. Somebody will make a better version of mapping, but maps themselves, geographical maps, they had hundreds of years, many hundreds of years, thousands. We've 15, so give us a bit of time. So no, there's no formal way. I mean, someone will find a better way and a better way of mapping as well. Good. Hang on. Did that make sense?
I think so.
So the other thing, you're gonna hate this then. People ask me, well, what do maps tell me? Do maps tell me what to do? And the answer is no. All they do is they show you a landscape. If you want to work out what to do, you have to apply thought. It's like you have to apply those patterns. So it's like when you map it out, you go Agile, Lean, Six Sigma. It's that application. All right, I'm gonna. Do I have? Shall I go into sovereignty a bit? Am I breaking up, or is it all right?
No, I think you're fine.
Okay, so let me go over here. Let me just finish this screen 2. Hang on. Can you see it says JDI sovereignty? Yeah, just do it sovereignty. Right, super duper. So, physical sovereignty. Easy subject, all right? So physical sovereignty is all about our collective, well, church, nation, your family, whatever happens to be your football club, our behaviors, our values, as in off the collective, and our borders. So this is our football club, or this is our church, or this is our nation, or this is my family's home, etc. And so physical sovereignty is all about that. And at a nation state level, really simple, we use maps to understand it. Now, unfortunately, a load of people are talking about digital sovereignty at the moment, and it's mostly storytellers, and there's some real problems. So before I get there, I have to get to the issue of values and behavior pretty quickly. So this is HS2 high-speed rail. That was the map. And one thing you should notice is you've got a principle, which is a doctrine. Doctrine is a collection of principles, so use appropriate methods. But on the same map, you've got two different beliefs. So on the left-hand side, you've got a belief in people over process, agile, extreme programming. Right-hand side, you've got a belief in process over people, Six Sigma. Now, they're polar opposite beliefs which can mutually exist at the same time because they're not exclusive on a single map, as long as you understand the context. If you can't map it, then it's difficult to know where to use what. All right. So I'm going to use this now to go through culture. So this is A.L. Kroeber. Despite a century of effort to define culture adequately, there is no agreement among anthropologists regarding its nature. Anthropologists have spent over 100 years trying to define culture and basically can't agree. So I love it when people say, oh, we need to get our culture right. Most people can't even describe it. And the problem is this. Margaret Mead pointed to it. Language is my favorite anthropologist. Language is a discipline of cultural behavior. So what that means is language is part of culture. Sounds pretty obvious, but here's the problem. Gödel's incompleteness theorem. If something is part of the model, you cannot use it to adequately describe the model. It can't be both complete and true. What that means is if language is part of culture, you won't be able to describe culture using language. No wonder they spent 100 years trying to do this. So, me being me, I thought I'd have to go mapping it. Genesis, custom, product, commodity. I remember I said the axis at the bottom, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is just a map of doctrine. Well, those are just labels. And you can use different labels, and this all comes from the cheat sheet, depending on whether we're talking about activities, practices, data, or knowledge. And I can, in fact, pick any label from 1, 2, 3, and 4 and use them together. So I can go concept, observation, emerging, convergent, accepted. That's perfectly fine. That's no different from Genesis, custom, product, commodity. And I use that when I'm mapping out ethical values. So if I look at a collective, depending on which collective it is, it might have a value of universal basic income, be emerging, paid holiday, more converging. It might have things like unionization, anti-discrimination laws, much more accepted. Those will be based upon things like workers' rights and civil rights. In the US, both of those come from abolition of slavery, which is based upon reciprocity and fairness. So what you can do is you can start mapping out the values in a collective. Now, normally, I would just take the most visible ones and crunch them down into what I call a pipeline. So what we've got is a pipeline of values belongs to a collective. And there's new ones appearing and they're evolving. Okay. Now, if you start there and then expand, you end up with something that looks like this, or what I have. This is my very imperfect map of what culture is. About 65 paths and components. You know, if you were just to define this, which just what's there, not what's not there, and without using the multiple combinations possible, you'd have 3 pages of text, just at least. In fact, to define the whole thing would be vastly more. So what you've got collective, behavior, values, landscape, doctrine, gameplay, safety. These are all interconnected components which make part of culture. So first things to note is not singular. We belong to many collectives. We can't just copy values from one collective to another and expect us to have their value, their culture, because value is just one part. You can adopt things like doctrine, but of course that'll vary according to your landscape. There are feedback loops in there, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So these are like, you know, the collective's desire to succeed. succeed at what in spreading our values depends upon behavior, but you know, if we're being successful, that increases safety and our sense of belonging, but of course that can spiral negatively as well. So you can use this to do all sorts of good and bad things. So I mean, this is going on at the moment in the UK. We've got a bit of a negative loop going on, which is breaking down people's trust. Another conversation. So sovereignty. So we talk about a collective, our behavior, our values, the collective. This is our behavior, which supports our values, and they're all linked to landscape. And so we have a map, physical map, and that's our borders, our behavior, our collective, our values inside our borders. So this is complex or complicated. It's both. Does it matter in a digital world? So almost. We'll get there. This is a map of a self-driving car. Sorry, not a map of a self-driving car, a map of the automotive industry, which was done in 2014 and rolled forward to 2025. Okay. And so pretty much most of the components are going to become commodity-like, increasingly self-driving cars. They don't matter that much. And it's interesting because I do a lot of nation-state competition, and when China is very good at targeting points of industrialization. It's where it builds its special economic zones. It plays the same game Amazon does, the innovate, leverage, commoditize game, moving up the right-hand side of the stack, but it's been doing it for much longer. Anyway, if you're in the automotive industry, you're facing this pretty horrible picture of like lots of the stuff about the vehicle is going to increasingly become more commodity-like. So how do you differentiate? Particularly when people stop owning cars and they just use them on a utility basis. How do we differentiate? And so the way you can do that is with digital subscription models. So in the DVLA, which is the Driving License Authority UK, we did this in 2014. We're mapping out how the industry is going to change because it affects license fees, driving license fees for you as a source of revenue. But there's something else here. Because these, sure enough, 2018, BMW started talking digital subscription models. And what that means in practice is two things, because it's connected to not only infotainment immersion, but also route management. The first and the less problematic is this. If you're a gold member and I'm a bronze member, then when you get into your car, it's a beautiful experience. If I get into my car, it's exactly the same car that you had, but I get wall-to-wall adverts. All right, so that's not very problematic, except for maybe psychological health or something along those lines, but otherwise not very problematic. The big problem is this one. And gold member comes along in their car, self-driving car, and there's a whole bunch of bronze members in front. Well, what are they going to expect to happen? They're going to expect all the bronze member cars to get out of the way so gold member can get to where they want to go quicker. Okay, so we embed digital subscription into route management. The problem for government is if we have a flood, that means all the poor people don't get out and all the better off people do, which means the next day we have pitchforks, revolution time. Not a sensible idea, just so that somebody like whatever can make some more money because they think embedding social inequality into a transportation system isn't going to cause us problems. Of course it is. All right, but there's something else here. If I think about the intelligent agents, those intelligent agents are built on simulation models, and those simulation models, it's the training of them, is where we embed our society's values. So that's where our collective's values are embedded in the training models, basically, for the agents. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's the thing like the trolley problem. Depends on how you train the AI. So if you've got like a trolley problem, it's coming along, and there's you can either kill the 5 people or the 1 person. Well, if you're in a society which believes in the sanctity of life, it's tough luck for the 1 person. But what if you value people differently? Maybe the one person's super wealthy and the 5 people are unemployed. Who do you kill them? Well, obviously kill the one person, except for some societies will go, oh no, you take the unemployed out. Depends on what you value. And we're starting to see this already, Beijing AI principle. So Beijing Communist Party's CCP, it's not even a communist party, it's a very skillful system. It's their 100th year anniversary next year. And of course, they're going to come after us with by tackling inequality, something we can't seem to do in the West. They've already pretty much hammered poverty, inequality is the next thing. But in the AI space, it's all about, you know, benefiting everyone. So we're already seeing the values of society, you know, because Confucianism very much focused on we, very much about the social group. These values are being embedded into these systems, and so that is, you know, where we used to play the game in physical spaces, imposing our values into other lands. That is happening in technology. And so that's the real issue of digital sovereignty, is where we as collectives, we want our behaviors and values, where do we want to enforce them or try to defend them in that landscape? No different from physical. The problem is that certainly in the West, we don't talk about it in this way. We don't use maps. We use stories. It's quite funny. It's like, you know, everything's a story. So, oh, we're gonna. My favourite was a few months ago. European Commission. Oh, 11.8 billion. We're going to build our own Amazon cloud. I mean, what a total waste of space. Waste of 11.8 billion. Why? If you actually map out the landscape, it's not what you would want to do. But of course, it's all story based. Summary. I started off with strategy, talked about maps, talked about being trapped by context, talked about patterns, different forms, talked about just get on with it, as in just try and do it, and talked about sovereignty. I suppose tips. Here's my biggest tip. Just say no to strategy, culture, structure, vision, sovereignty. Just don't do it. Focus on awareness and doctrine. Once you've got those sorted, then you can do the other stuff. You try the harder stuff, but focus on awareness and doctrine first of all. At that point, I will definitely go quiet.
Thank you, Simon.
Pleasure.
Let me check the...
Is anybody left? They all ran away.
Salve, do you want to ask your question from earlier yourself?
Let's see, can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks for doing this, Simon. I'm a big fan.
Pleasure.
Of you. Let's see if I can find my old question in the list here. So I'd like your take on using your maps or whatever related concepts you've been talking about today to get a hold of all the goodness and badness that a business or a community can get from open source.
Oh, okay. So I have a long background.
Yeah, I'll try and focus the question a little bit. I'm specifically interested in how to manage risk. For example, in my business, we depend on open source in many ways, but we notice that some of those dependencies have been quote unquote forgotten by their hosts, their managers, for example, and we want to figure out if we should change our direction or if we should adopt the projects, and also make those issues come forth in our mind. And I'd love to hear your take on this.
Okay, so there's a couple of different things there. One is a general risk management question, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about open source or not. So that is the same sort of logic tree dependencies and or of different components, and being able to question what is the impact of one thing on another thing. The second thing is the impact itself of open source. So what open source tends to do is accelerate the evolution of something. So it drives it quickly to more commodity, or accelerates that process of moving something. And there's all sorts of reasons why lots of reasons why that can be very strategically useful. Part of the problem, however, and it's a general problem in the industry, is that people sort of think like open source is a magic thing, a bit like agile. And so we've had a lot of people going, oh, if we open source this, then of course a magic will happen. What it's good at is industrializing, helping to industrialize things, but you have to put effort into it. So I'm not a fan, by the way, of open by default. I'm a fan of open by thinking. So I like to map out the environment and look at how I'm going to use open approaches to basically commoditize something. And that can be for reasons of, and the reason why I map it out is I might use it against others to undermine barriers to entry into an industry. There can be all sorts of positive reasons for doing something. I've actually got a meeting later on this week with a bunch of people in the open source community where we're doing actually some mapping of open source, because we've got some concerns by some of the things that are going on within Europe at the moment. It is the security stuff. There's lots of people mapping in the security area. I would probably suggest going and going along outside of this group, going along and joining the awesome list. You'll find there's a Slack channel in there. If you just give a shout out, there's usually a whole bunch of security people lurking there as well. Does that answer the question?
Not completely, but it was a good question, a good answer.
Oh, okay. Let's do it another way then. Hang on. Hang on. I want to give you an answer.
I don't want to take too much time.
No.
Lots of people here.
I know. This won't take long.
I can give you some context if that helps.
Oh yes, please. Context is always good.
Yeah. So the perspective I have in mind here is from the management or the insiders of one particular open source community, where they want to make sure that everybody involved in there are producing value for the businesses that use this ecosystem.
Okay, so first of all, we're going to need to you're going to tell me what project you have, because no user has an.
Yeah, I think you might know it already. It's the CPAN and Perl community.
Oh, fantastic! Oh, that's wonderful. We're still waiting for Perl 6, but there we are. No,
it's been out for 5 years.
I know. I was teasing about that.
It has a new name.
Yes, and CPAN is, of course, well, a lot of us, it's fantastic community-driven effort and everything else. So what is the problem with going on with CPAN, other than the fact that we've now, well, it lost its spark when other languages were able. We had the whole Perl 5, Pony, and all that sort of stuff, which sort of slowed us down waiting for Perl 6, and other languages charged in there. So from the user point of view, the user wants to get something done.
There are parts of CPAN which is super useful, quite lively and responsive, and lots of value. There are other parts that might be deeper down in the dependency tree that work, have stable code, but if something shows up, like a security issue or something, there might be no response having it fixed. And those it's specifically how, what I'm looking for is how to identify and show these kind of problems to my colleagues.
Okay.
And the community.
Okay. User wants some sort of app. App requires some sort of runtime, which used to be .NET, used to be LAMP, whatever. That's now shifted over to Lambda. serverless. Here they are building their code functions, etc., etc. So you can just use those as a utility. It's like in the past we would use something like cpan repository, which is all sort of wonderful, etc. I'm sure that Amazon and whoever else are just mining cpan anyway to get ideas of sort of functions to actually build in there as well. I mean, that's the future. Okay, tricky one, because generally when you talk about open source, one of its real powers is you take something, you open source it, you drive it towards more of a commodity, which you can use to undermine others and all that sort of stuff, and etc. In this case, our problem is the runtime itself, because this will make people scream, but the runtime itself is becoming a utility. And you know, okay, there's different language types in here, but mostly it's focusing now on JavaScript, I imagine. Which basically means all of this stuff. I know everybody wants to build their own clouds and their own data centers, and that's all just inertia. Yeah, it's a difficult, tricky one, because that's pretty much as if you put cpan over here and Perl here. Well, yeah. Ooh.
Well, cpan isn't one thing. We should keep that in mind. It's thousands, literally tens of thousands of things. And some of them are completely fine and stable and predictable and safe to bet on. And
yeah, but you're talking about a repository of functions, okay, yes, in cpan. And the thing about Lambda is, you know, the thing about function-based development is Amazon gets to see the duplication of functions, how people are using things, because it can mine the metadata, not the data, but the metadata. So it basically can use this to recreate. In fact, I did a talk in Amazon sometime many years ago, because I happen to know the people who put the serverless team together. They can rebuild cpan within it, and which is exactly what they should be doing. I haven't looked recently because I've been just busy with other stuff. But all the good ideas were in cpan, repository of functions based upon Perl as the runtime. Yeah, I'd have to think about this one because it's pretty gloomy at the moment.
Yeah.
That picture.
Thanks for the effort.
No. I love Perl. Great community and everything else. But is Perl? Have we got Perl part of Lambda? Do you know?
I have no idea.
Okay. But generally, the point about open is you can use open to drive things to more of a commodity, which you can use to undermine barriers, do all sorts of things, sap energy from others. It's all sorts of gameplay. Great stuff, as well as reducing the cost of building new things on top. So it accelerates innovation as well. So yeah, open approaches are great. The killer is, we should have got, Amazon should have built with Perl. Lambda, damn. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that one.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Sorry, I don't have an instant answer for you.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions more, Simon, if you are up for it.
I have, let me just double check. I have got another call to join at 9 o'clock dealing with culture, nation stuff.
Okay, we'll be quick. Geir,
that's all right.
Question? Geir?
Yeah. So my question was, you had a slide up which talked about the feedback loop between different maps. So you use a map to decide on your course of action.
Yeah.
And then after the scenario is passed, then you do a revision and you do a learning session there. So I was wondering, do you have any advice for how we could do that comparison of maps or in any other way learn from what we've gone through so far?
So I do pre-mortem, post-mortem. So pre-mortem, let's use a map to challenge what we're going to do. Then let's go and do it, and then do post-mortem. And which is why you keep the maps around. You pre-mortem, keep the map, look after it. Post-mortem, question what went wrong, what did we learn from the map. That's how I spot new patterns. There must be other ways of doing it I'm not aware of. I don't use any. I mean, that's just how I do things. Remember, this is still a field in its infancy. So if you find a better way of doing it, please share. It's all Creative Commons, and the community does tend to share things. So if you find a better way, please tell us.
Thank you.
My only tip, by the way, on that is don't forget to do it. It's really useful. Sorry.
No. Tore, would you like to ask your question? Okay, I think he might have left, but he asked if it would be interesting for other. It's a newbie question. He finds it hard to start the map. Where is a normal place to place the user anchor on different phases? Any tip?
So, hang on a second. Let's see if I've got this. Evolution capital. Hang on. Yeah, that'll do. Right. Just going to share my screen again. Share screen. Can you see that at all?
Yes. Oh, we see the. It's not so easy reading.
Okay, so I'll expand it a little bit more. Hang on. This is the cheat sheet. Can you read that at all?
Yes, Tore said.
Okay, so basically each of the stages of evolution, activities, data, practice, knowledge. So these are just the labels. So stage 1, Genesis, or you could use unmodeled or novel concept. And these are the characteristics. Tends to be rare, poorly understood, describe the wonder of the thing, discovery of some new marvel, publication types, undefined market, and knowledge management is uncertain. So it's like a list of characteristics. And so what I tend to do with users is exactly the same. Just go through and go something like this, is this type of user, are they rare? Are we, it's a bit, is it focused on build construction? Are they mainly in this sort of space? Is it a forming market, I suppose? Maybe be something I would start ticking off some of these. It doesn't quite work for users, so some more than others. And I use that to give me an idea of where the users should go. So I use the cheat sheet for that as well. Let me shut that down without saving. Did I answer the question, or have I failed to answer the question again?
I think that one was spot on.
Yes.
Okay, super.
Ole?
Yeah, I had one short question going pretty far back in your slides when you talk about OODA loops.
Oh, yes.
Because John Boyd, I recently been reading up on it, and he talks a lot about like maneuverability and getting inside the opponent's loop. Is that part, have you sort of translated that to strategic thinking?
So I, in my Doctrine table, you'll see there's fast and expensive, simple and tiny, which comes from Lieutenant Colonel Dan Ward. It's built quickly, inexpensively, simple, and now that's in terms of general principles. And I recommend reading Simplicity Cycle and Lieutenant Colonel Dan Ward's stuff. Now, when it comes to gameplay, which is the whole leadership bit, which is about identifying where you're going to attack, the scenario planning in terms of looking at the options that you have and your opponent has, doing basically using gameplay like open plays. I have a map of mapping. There you are. Let me show you a map of mapping. Hang on. I must have a map of mapping somewhere. There we are. There we are. So this is ages old. I should probably really update this, but hang on. Oops. I share screen 2. Can you see my map of mapping?
Yes.
So I start off with my purpose, explain topographical intelligence of the world, scope, demonstrate, disprove the concept, imperative, rebel against the consultants that enslave us, survive, make revenue, and that requires various other components. And then, of course, what I'd marked on here was open approaches. So I wrote this ages ago so this is why I opened up all the doctrine, opened up all the maps in terms of the method of actually mapping and the climactic patterns and how to anticipate. So I'm generally, because what I'm trying to do is industrialize all the mapping stuff as quick as possible. Sounds a fair quid pro quo. Everybody gets to learn how to map and helps play the game better, but then it has a commercial benefit to myself, you see, which is that one over there, context specific forms of gameplay. So I said there's about 110 different ways I know of manipulating the market. I don't do a great deal telling people those. I mean, I do a little bit online in the book and everything else. I certainly haven't gone through all of them because I keep some of them. Because once you've got rid of all the typical problems of not focusing on user needs and duplicating things everywhere and all that sort of nonsense, once you've got rid of all of that and you've started to learn, you know, my intention is to be a strategic arms sale. Arms sales. I'll sell strategic weapons. Have you tried this technique, etc.? Because, you know, ultimately that's what strategy consultants should be doing, is teaching people techniques to manipulate markets, etc., in their favor, rather than going around writing these god-awful long thick reports which are generally lack any sort of context. Or, you know, I read this stuff people write, oh, you should use agile everywhere. I mean, it's gibberish at the best of times, but so you know, so yes, you can learn to use maps and learn to manipulate spaces and learn gameplay. And I may not reveal everything because I also want to keep some advantage to myself. Now, to your question about the speed at which you go through, this doesn't take long. Once you get good at it, you learn the patterns and everything else. It's like playing chess. Once you do it a lot, you get very, very quick. Or actually, you stay the same speed, you just get much better. Beginners, when they first start, spend too long going, you know, where should I put this? Move the first piece. Yeah, eventually, you just learn to get into the game.
But I mean, like, one thing is mapping and understanding the patterns. Another thing is executing the patterns, like the speed of implementing.
Okay. So strategy consultancies love to go, there's a difference between strategy and execution. Yeah. Why? Because that way they can say the strategy was great, it was your execution that was rubbish. No, it doesn't work like that. I mean, strategy and execution are all part of the same thing. It's understanding your landscape, your capabilities, the speed at which you can move people. I totally understand the whole OODA loop in terms of getting inside the other opponent's cycle. But what you've got to remember with business, people aren't even looking at the landscape, all right? So they're not even doing the observe bit mostly. I mean, most companies, you can just stand there and watch themselves shoot themselves in the foot if somebody else comes into their space who knows what they're doing. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I sat in the boardroom of IBM in 2008, sat down and went through how they were going to lose their entire hardware industry to this bookseller who'd produced a utility service before. And I even went through and said, and you're going to tell me I'm wrong, and here's the 16 different forms of inertia, like your pre-existing capital, your existing revenue streams, and went through all of that. And I explained how it was going to cause co-evolution of practice, higher order systems went through the patterns. And at the end, they went, no, it's never going to happen because of existing relation. They just repeated back to the inertia that I had. So I do understand the whole OODA thing in terms of being faster. And of course, eventually that may matter. But at the moment, we've got bigger problems in the fact that most companies don't understand the landscape. They don't even understand their value chain. That's clear from COVID. A lot of them don't understand their user needs, and a surprising number of them don't even understand who their users are.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree, but it'd be before you can do that stuff, it's a good idea that people stop running around with guns and blindfolds.
All right, I think we're. Is there anything more in the chat, Ole?
Can I ask a question? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, please.
Yeah, great. I actually had two questions, Simon. I mean, I'm a huge fan. I mean, honestly, one of the ways my company is basing its strategy is off your methods, and we believe we're kind of way ahead of the curve. So I really want to thank you for that.
My pleasure. My absolute pleasure. I hope it is useful to you, and if it turns into a total disaster and I was completely wrong and everything else and blah blah blah, I will apologize now.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I kind of had two questions. I mean, I'll try to keep this short. One was obviously you mentioned that things on the left side have a higher chance of failing, of course, because they're obviously more unknown. I was thinking a little bit about how one would perhaps reduce that complexity. And the other would being that you mentioned that a lot of these companies have this heavy inertia towards change and altering their ways. I mean, what's a good approach of kind of going forward with them in order to kind of help them see the error of their ways?
Okay. So fantastic questions. I'm just going to share. Sorry, my handwriting is so dreadful. I mean, can you see the whiteboard? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So one of my favorite things is, oops. We'll go. We have something appear, comes a product, more of a commodity. Whoops. Okay. So when something evolves, it often goes through hundreds of diffusion curves. The reason for this is this evolution axis. Well, you'll see it in the blog if you read. Is actually made of many. There is a big difference between diffusion and evolution. So often you'll get, the appearance of something will diffuse to a small market, and then you'll get a product will come out, and that will diffuse to a slightly larger market, then a better product, and that will diffuse to a slightly larger and slightly larger, etc. You can't actually link evolution to adoption in a market. It doesn't work, unfortunately. Data doesn't support it. But what we can say is that as something evolves, it can often go through hundreds of diffusion curves and hundreds of, therefore, chasms. So there's an interesting thing here. When you get product substitution, you often get disruption of one product by another product, or you can get disruption. It's often complementary, but sometimes you can get disruption, like Nokia versus, I don't know, Apple iPhone. And the thing is, that's really difficult to anticipate which one's going to win, which is why Christensen said he didn't think the iPhone was going to be successful. It turned out to be massively successful. And it's also why Lepore was going on about how disruption theory is not predictable. But the problem here is this. Oops. You also get disruption when you shift from product to more utility. So that's like Amazon versus IBM, etc. But in this case, it's highly predictable because it's actually not dependent upon individual actors' actions, but actually total aggregate market actions. So we have a good idea when, or roughly when, industrialization is likely to occur. But we can also say lots of things about it, like how it will enable new higher order system, emerging practices and new higher order systems, new needs, etc. How it's going to be a punctuated equilibrium, and how we're going to get capital flows in these sorts of direction, etc. So there's quite a lot we can say about it. But unfortunately, in the industry, both of these things are called disruption. So people go disruption, and they call this disruption, even though one of them's predictable, one of them's not predictable. So, which is why you get this whole Lepore Christensen argument, with Lepore going, disruption theory is not predictable, and Christensen going, it is. Well, they're both right and both wrong, because it is depending upon which bit of disruption you're talking about. And a lot of this stuff is also complicated by other words like innovation. So one of my favorite is we call every novel and new thing an innovation, every custom-built example of something an innovation, every feature differentiation on a product an innovation, and every shift from product to more utility models like cloud an innovation. So actually all you ever see is innovation everywhere, okay? Which is why, I go in, well, Six Sigma works over here. So people will go, well, Six Sigma works for innovation. Yeah, if it's that sort of use of the word innovation. But if you're using that sort of the word innovation, then as in Genesis, that's when you want to use extreme programming. But unfortunately, we use singular words. So the point about this is once you start mapping the landscape, I mean, you have to apply thought to it. It's never going to give you, it's not a crystal ball, but you can apply common patterns and patterns that we know happen, and you can anticipate this sort of stuff. So my friends, Adlam, when a security company, they used mapping, and the board built their company. They sold it to Microsoft for a couple $100 million or whatever it was. They used it in that space to, it was quite interesting because you get these analyst reports telling us that this or that, or they used to phone me at 2 o'clock in the morning sometimes saying, we've had this analyst, they think this is important, our map saying it isn't. And depending on the analyst, we might agree with them, because if they put us in the right place in the magic quadrant, all was good. And but we weren't doing it because they were talking sense at all. So those are games of manipulating market perception. So I suppose my answer to your question is there is no crystal ball. I think that mapping out will at least force you to think about the components and challenge what you're doing. It'll hopefully get over this problem of everything's in innovation and these words like disruption, which cover 2 different forms. It helps you, well, as you get better over time, I suppose it's just a more precise way of describing a changing environment. But, it's not a crystal ball, never will be. But then challenge, discussion, and understanding of the landscape always seem a relatively sensible thing to do. Now, how do you get people to do it? Tricky one. If they're military background, it's easy. You just say, we've got no situational awareness, no maps. And then people go, gosh, we don't. And that's easy. If you've got somebody who's been doing strategy for 20 years and you're about to tell them they don't know what they're talking about because they've never looked at the landscape, that's always going to be a difficult conversation. How do you deal with that one? Sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's easier with some people to find them a quicker route to retirement. There we are. Does that sort of answer your question?
Oh yeah, that was perfect. I mean, I really appreciate this. And I couldn't help but notice that you placed the need between Genesis and custom is that kind of the golden spot to constantly look for needs, kind of where they're kind of almost undiscovered?
So bizarrely enough, so that's really interesting. Just scrub it all out. Hang on. Actually, I can probably just press there. Ah, there we are. That's so much better. So can you see it all in red? Yes. I'm just making sure. Genesis, custom, product, commodity. Right. Let's take something. Let's do this in black. Something's evolved. Oh, I was going to do it in black. There we are. Something's evolved from product to more of a commodity. Okay. Like, I don't know, EC2, compute. And we decide to build something on top. Okay, some new thing. I don't know. Kitten internet. There we are. Kitten internet, which obviously requires all sorts of things, including lots of compute power. Now, the Genesis space is high risk, very high risk. But, you know, if you think about forward, it's got huge potential value going forward. It's just high risk and very uncertain. Okay. Is there a way of reducing that risk? Yeah, you can use the maps to not do daft things, like we're going to custom build our own compute or custom build our electricity. That would be a really bad idea, because it would just increase the cost of what we're trying to do. And one of the reasons why you do use commodity components is it reduces cost and speed of what we're trying to do. But there's also another side to this, because often what will happen is if we build something and it's evolving, people like to do what's called rent extraction or whatever. Now the danger is if you are building on somebody else's service, which you want to do for speed in order to keep up, they can mine the metadata. So if there's like lots of people building on top, I focused over here for efficiency, and everybody else is building on top. So they're all innovating, as in Genesis innovating. And then one of you, Kitten Internet, starts becoming successful. Well, from the metadata, the consumption of my API, I can spot that you're growing. I'm not looking at your data. I'm just looking at the consumption of my API. And if I've got thousands of companies over here, they act as a sensing engine. So I'm simply mining that to spot new patterns, which I then release as a new service, which everybody else builds on top. And so this is the basis of the innovate, leverage, commoditize model. And it's a very simple way of becoming highly efficient, innovative, customer focused all at the same time, simultaneously. And it grows with the size of the ecosystem. But you can read about it in AWS's book, or you can read about it on my blog, because I wrote about it a long, long time ago, which is why if you think Amazon's tough today, as their ecosystem grows, they'll just become more innovative, more customer focused, more efficient. They'll be tougher tomorrow. Now, at this point, I need to jump off.
Yeah,
I get another call. So I hope that was okay.
Simon, thank you so much on behalf of everybody here. It was really great. We learned a lot from, I think everybody learned something new, and it was a great session. So thank you so much for letting us into your world.
Pleasure. It was a delight. Good to see you, and take care.